We are this morning looking at the theme of what's next. The idea that we are moving into the future, and the question comes up, what's next? What's next for our country, the elections? What's next for our church as we move through this virus situation? What's next for us individually, as we all have our individual hopes and dreams and fears and joys and sorrows, as we just sang, some through the water, some through the flood, some through the fire, but also some on the mountain where the sun shines so bright. God leads along. So what next? Now, the doctrine that is the official teaching in the Christian church that covers this whole question of the future, of what's coming up in the future, is called the providence of God. And the word providence and providence of God means that God is looking out, He is looking ahead. Pro video, that's how the word providence is constructed. Pro video. Video meaning to watch, to see, and pro meaning up ahead. And so God is up ahead. And perhaps the simplest definition of the providence of God is that God is planning the future as He cares for His creation. He is planning the future as He cares for His creation. Now that's a simple definition. What gets complicated, what gets difficult is, what does that mean? What does it mean that God is planning the future? Does it mean that every single detail has been foreordained and predestined and planned by God? Or does it mean that God is planning the future, but He's leaving lots of openings for us to think and act and make decisions, and He's gonna react to those decisions, and that the future is an open book? It's very flexible. Or is it tight? Is it predetermined? Now, our church is rooted in a tradition that is called Reformed or Calvinistic. Now, I say we're rooted in that. We have people in our congregation, as well as in our leadership, on our church staff, who come from other backgrounds. We have Catholic backgrounds and Baptist backgrounds and Nazarene backgrounds and all kinds of backgrounds. So we are rooted in that Reformed Calvinistic tradition, with the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession that come out of the Reformation as standards of faith. Yet at the same time, we are open to people expressing other views, having other ideas. Because what we emphasize here is not that you have to subscribe to a particular doctrine, but that you are focused on Jesus Christ, that you are saved by the blood of Christ, that you are in Christ, you are devoted to Jesus. And so we have some people who have different views of the end of the world over against what others have, or of baptism, as well as on this theme, this doctrine called the providence of God. Now, the Reformed Calvinistic teaching is that God has predestined, has foreordained, has determined all that has happened, that is happening, and will happen. It's a very closed system. It has been predetermined, predestined. And so you go to passages like Acts chapter 2, verse 23, where Peter is giving his a great Pentecost sermon. And there he says that the crucifixion of Jesus, he says, was the set purpose and the foreknowledge of God. So Jesus wasn't just crucified because some people didn't like him. That was the set purpose, and it was foreordained by the foreknowledge of God. And then in Romans chapter 11, verse 36, the Apostle Paul says that all things are from and through God the Father. All things are from and through. There's there's every detail covered by the decrees of God. Or the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 1, in chapter 1, verse 11, he says that we have been predestined by the goodness of God, by his graciousness. We have been predestined, foreordained for our salvation and to live in Christ. And so the Calvinists have been over, I'm going to gesture like this, over on this side, that the future is planned in every detail by God. So your birth, your death, whom you marry, what kind of work you do, it's all predestined. It's all planned very specifically by God. That is discussed in a book that I've had on my shelf for a while, and I got it out for this message. It's called 4 Views on Divine Providence. And the first chapter in here by the first author, there's 4 different authors. The first chapter is that Reformed Calvinistic point of view. And by the way, if anybody would like to, it's not an easy read. It's a little bit more difficult, but if anybody would like to read about the providence of God and the various approaches to it, the various theories or views on it, you might want to check with me on this book. It's called 4 Views on Divine Providence, and then there's 4 different authors. And when you read the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession, they bring out this idea that all things are under the planning and the control of God. However, that position, that view of God's providence, obviously has some problems. And so the 4th chapter in this book is the other side of the coin. And so I'm going to gesture over here. It is the other side of the coin because the 4th author, very Christian, uses lots of Bible passages. But the 4th position in this book, the other side of the coin, is that God does not have everything pre-planned and foreordained. You see, one of the problems that you have with the Calvinistic Reformed position, that everything has been foreordained and pre-planned, one of the problems you have is evil. How do you explain evil? If God has predestined everything, how do you explain Adolf Hitler? How do you explain the mistake that you made yesterday and the sin that you committed this morning? See, has God foreordained evil? And that gets to be a knotty problem. And a second problem that you run into with the Reformed Calvinistic position is that the Bible doesn't really seem to speak that way. See, this Reformed position is rooted in, it's based on what is called the sovereignty of God. That is, that God is sovereign and therefore He has to have control over every single situation. Pre-planned, foreordained. But that 4th position in that book says, no, because you've got the problem of evil and you also have the problem of the way that the Bible talks. The way that the Bible talks. And I want to give you an example of what I mean when I say the way that the Bible talks. In the book of Numbers, chapter 14, we have the record of how God is upset with His people of Israel. They're in the wilderness. He's taken them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about this. By your power you brought these people up from among them, from the Egyptians, and then they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. And they have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And if you put all these people to death, now look at what's happening here. See, if you say God has predestined everything, he has determined everything, everything is fixed, then how do you explain the fact that these Israelite people are serving idols, they're disobedient, and that God he is very upset. And he says to Moses, basically, he says, you know, Moses, I'm sick and tired of these people. I have tried. I have brought them out of the land of Egypt. I have given them good gifts. I have protected them. I have rescued them from their enemies. I have rescued them. I've given them manna to eat. And they still behave that way, so I'm sick and tired of it. I'm going to destroy them. And then Moses begins to have dialogue with God. Moses says, Lord, you don't want to do that. What are the Egyptians going to think? Because they recognize you as being the sovereign God that brought these people out from their own land, and now you're going to destroy them? It's not going to make you look very good, God. It's not going to make... See, that kind of conversation back and forth, that kind of attitude on the part of God doesn't fit the idea of a fixed plan, that everything is working out according to a fixed plan. Let's finish reading the passage. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you, God, they will say, the Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, and so he slaughtered them in the wilderness. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. And the Lord replied, I have forgiven them. So God says, okay, Moses, okay, I agree. I'm not going to destroy. See, this doesn't sound like a God who has everything predestined, planned, fixed. He says, okay, I forgive them. I've forgiven them. Nevertheless, as surely as they live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs that I performed in Egypt in the wilderness, but because they disobeyed me and they tested me 10 times, not one of them will see the land of promise, the promised land. Now, when that kind of passage was talked about when I was back in seminary, which was a Reformed Calvinistic seminary, the professor said, what is happening in that passage is called an anthropomorphism. That is, God is just appearing to act kind of like in a human way, but really he's got it all planned and figured out. He's got it all predestined. But he's talking with Moses and he's debating back and forth with Moses as if he doesn't have it planned, but he really does. Or take Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Notice now how God is going to test his people. He says, if a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces you a sign or a wonder, and if the sign or wonder spoken of in that place by the prophet says, let us follow other gods, gods you have not known, and let us worship them, then you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you. Now, some of you in the Wednesday night Bible study, you remember this past Wednesday night, one of the people said, well, God doesn't test. God doesn't test. He does. The Bible says God does test. Now, if he tests, it means that, well, what? That he's not sure how you're going to act. He's not sure how you're going to behave. And so the author of that 4th chapter says the future is open. And God's kind of like sitting at a big computer keyboard, and as you make decisions, he types in a new plan. Okay, I planned this, but... And the New Testament also talks about God testing. Look at 2 Corinthians In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, chapter 2, the Apostle Paul says, another reason I wrote you, says Paul, that you would stand the test. That is, your behavior as Corinthians is apparently not fixed and predetermined. They're going to be tested. And a beautiful passage in the book of Psalms, Psalm 37, verse 4. In Psalm, it says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. See, this approach over here says, delight in the Lord because he is giving you the desires of his heart, what he has predestined. But in the Psalm, it seems to say that if you delight in the Lord and you have a desire in your heart, then God will give you that. If you don't delight in the Lord, then he won't give you that. In other words, as this fourth author says, the future is open. And God says, I'm going to do things depending on your decisions and your behavior, your attitudes. Some examples. Let's say, for example, that you have an 18-year-old male who has begun to work with a carpenter, and that carpenter is going to teach him carpentry. The young man is going to be an apprentice, and he's getting paid $10 an hour. And in God's plan, he's going to have this young man become an expert carpenter and someday build an amazing house for a family that has fostered numberless children and has adopted 7, 8 children, and they need a great big house and this young man is someday going to build that house. But the young man decides after a while that $10 an hour isn't enough, and he's offered $15 an hour by a company to be a night watchman, and so he quits his job as the apprentice, and he takes the job as the night watchman, and 40 years later, he retires as the night watchman of that company. Now, those kinds of things happen. Does that mean that God had planned for that young man to build that house someday as an expert carpenter, but that young man thwarted the plans of God and did something else, and God had to find somebody else to do it? This example, let's say that a young person will say he's going to be an apprentice again with a carpenter, and so he moves off in this direction. He's going to become a carpenter. But after being in carpentry for a few years, he's approached by someone who says, you've got great gifts in the area of business and management and finance. I think you ought to go to school. And so he does. He quits his carpenter job, and then he becomes a student, and he learns finances, and he becomes an investment person, and he's deeply involved in finance. And for about 10 years, he works in that field. And then his family comes to him and says, you're the only one left who can take over the family business. We want you to you've had a lot of experience now in business and finance. We want you to take over the family business. And so he does. Now, were all three of those experiences predestined by God, or did that young man or young woman make the decision himself or herself? And God goes, I thought he was going to be a carpenter. Now he's going to school. Okay, all right. Now I got to redesign things because this person now is going to be in finance. And then after 10 years, God says, going into the family business. Okay, now I got to kind of rewrite the future because now this person is moving into the family business. You see, that seems to be the way the Bible talks. What decision you make, what behavior you have, what attitudes you have, what direction you take is your decision. And it's kind of like you and God are back and forth having that discussion. And then he perhaps blocks the way or opens the way or blesses in this direction. But you're working back and forth. Very different than over here where everything is totally and completely designed and predetermined. I got a book this past week. One of our members gave me as a gift this book. It's a new book by Dr. David Jeremiah. Really good, by the way. Very easy read. Very nice. It's called Forward, and it's about moving into the future. And he talks in here, David Jeremiah talks in here about Nehemiah. When Nehemiah, remember, he was cupbearer to the king, and he wanted to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And David Jeremiah says in his book, Nehemiah didn't come up with the dream for Jerusalem's walls all by himself. His heart was receptive to the burdens and impressions that God sent him. A prayerful heart is fertile ground for divine ideas. Now, do you hear the kind of thing he's saying? God didn't predestine Nehemiah to go and build the wall and put the decision to do so in his heart. He put ideas in Nehemiah's heart. He put dreams in his mind. And finally, Nehemiah did what God wanted him to do. But it was kind of a back and forth. The future was open. Is that the way it goes? So as we move into the future, what's next? Is it a matter of doors will be open as I make decisions, or is it fixed? Billy Graham had finished Bible college, and he really wanted to preach. He was looking for different places and ways to preach, and he especially wanted to preach in a chapel. It was called the West Tampa Gospel Mission. But he wasn't sure how he could convince the director of that chapel, Mr. Corwin, to have him preach. He was just a young man, fresh out of school. And so Billy Graham literally went and knelt in prayer on the front lawn of that mission. And he finished the prayer, he stood up, and Mr. Corwin came walking out the door and saw him and said, Billy, our speaker for tonight just canceled. Would you take over? Now, had Billy gone out for lunch that day with a friend and chit-chatted over burgers and Cokes and then went home, would he have preached in that mission? Or did he preach in that mission because he prayed and then Mr. Corwin came? Or did God have that all predestined? So as we live our lives, it would appear, if we really believe in the sovereignty of God, that God does have everything under his control. We sang it earlier. He is the ruler yet. At the same time, the Bible's language and the experiences that we have seem to indicate that there's a back and forth and there's an openness with God. And so I thought, what kind of a conclusion can I come to today as we face the future? What's next? And I came up with a slogan, and it goes like this, that we live as though. Live as though. We live as though everything is open. And my prayers, my attitudes, my actions, my decisions influence God's ideas and God's decisions and God's attitudes and God's actions. But also live as though everything is predetermined. Everything is predestined. Everything is set. You live as though. Both of them. Both of them. Both of them. You live as though. And so in that same book, Forward by Dr. David Jeremiah, good book. There it is in case you want to get it. It's got a nice cover. It's called Forward. He talks about prayer. And he says, how vast are the possibilities of prayer, how wide its reach, what great things are accomplished by this divinely appointed means of grace. Prayer, now listen to this next part, and this is the live as though. God is waiting to hear what you have to say and how you're living. The future is open, the door is open. Listen to what he says. Prayer lays its hand on Almighty God and moves him to do what he would not otherwise do if prayer were not offered. Really? Prayer brings things to pass which would never otherwise occur. See, that's the live as though. The future is open. But the first author in this book tells the story of a warrior during the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson. And he was in a fierce battle during the Civil War. Bullets flying over just big cannonballs, people dying all around him. It was horrible. And Stonewall Jackson, who was a Presbyterian, they're Calvinists, he was very calm. And one of his captains asked him, "General, why are you so calm?" And he said, "My religious belief teaches me to feel as safe in battle as in bed. God has fixed the time for my death, and I do not concern myself with that, but I am always ready, whenever it may overtake me. That is the way all people should live. Then all people would be equally brave. I'm as calm in battle as I am in bed because God's got it all planned." You live as though. You live as though. See, if you only live this way, well, God's got it all planned. Doesn't really matter what I do. It takes away that sense, like we saw in Numbers and Deuteronomy, that sense of responsibility, being tested, the adventure, the prayer, the expectation. It takes that away. Doesn't matter what I do. At the same time, if you only live as though things depended upon you and God was just sitting there waiting, then where is his power? And where is the peace? And where is the confidence that all things will work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose? He is the ruler yet. And so if you asked me, of those 2 chapters in that book, the first one and the last one, which one do you believe? I would say yes. I live as though today has already been determined by God. And I live as though I better do a little extra work this afternoon if people are going to figure out that sermon tonight. I live as though. I live as though. And so I have the adventure and I have the peace. He is the ruler yet, and yet he will test me so that I will make decisions to bring glory to him while affirming his absolute sovereign power.